Okay, so this is the XR Investment Trends Power Panel. I don't know why it's a power panel compared to a normal panel or what the difference is exactly. But we're going to spend the next 40 minutes discussing the investment landscape for immersive technology, hopefully get a few war stories or anecdotes from folks and get some opinions. We're going to have 20 minutes of us discussing, and then we're going to open it up to the audience as well. So I need you all to come up with your hardest questions possible so we can really, really grill them. All right, so to begin, I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Does this work? Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. So my name is Harri, and if you can't roll your R's, you can say Harri. I am from Helsinki, Finland. I am the director of Nordic VR Startups. We are an accelerator, a VR/AR accelerator, mainly focusing on very early stage Nordic VR and AR companies. We invest into the companies that we accelerate. We invest up to 100,000 euros. And we offer them coaching, mentoring, and all kinds of business advice, as well as a global network, because we have a sister program in Tokyo called Tokyo VR Startups, and also a sister program in Seoul called Seoul VR Startups. Our lead investor in the accelerator is a company called Gumi, which is a Japanese mobile gaming company who's done a lot of VR investments. For example, they are, I think, the biggest investor in the VR fund in San Francisco, and they've done some direct investments as well. So for the last year, I've basically seen everything that the Nordics have to offer in terms of like startups and investing in that, and hopefully I can share some of the insights with you guys.
Thanks. My name's Eleanor Whitley. I'm the executive producer of a company called Marshmallow Laser Feast, and I also sit on the board, on the Access to Finance working group of Immerse UK. So I'm here with sort of two hats on. One to bring those few insights that are from that working group about the kind of the scene in terms of funding for UK-based businesses right now, but also from Marshmallow Laser Feast point of view, we're a content studio. We've been making immersive pieces, artworks or experiences for a few years now, in the last couple of years focusing on VR and a bit of AR now as well. And so my angle is much more on what money's around for content, what's scalable in terms of content, what are people investing in outside of the infrastructure, and kind of the things that we actually experience.
My name is Colaianni. I'm from a company called VR Bound. Most recently, we've interacted with over 500 different VR companies across the world with the International VR Awards, which we hosted earlier in October. With plans to increase that again for 2018. Most notably, I think it's been interesting to hear directly from these different companies with some research that we've been putting together and the interactions on what their pain points are and kind of the trends that they've been experiencing directly from their mouths.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Dann. I'm the CEO of a company called Amplify Robot. Basically, we're a content company. We've been in the AR space for 10 years and virtual reality for 6 years. We work in lots of different things, so whether it's automotive, immersive, gameplay, or whether it's specific white label projects for companies, that's what we do. I'm also the CEO of another VR company called Medical Realities. And Medical Realities uses virtual reality to train medical students to become surgeons. And I'm also the co-chair of the VR and AR Association here in London.
Busy man. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about to start this discussion is, so 2017 was quite an interesting year for the VR and the AR and the XR and the MR world. We saw companies such as Improbable get massive investments of $500 million. And then we also saw some really popular, quite large companies start to go under because they couldn't continue to raise money after their seed rounds. So we saw companies like AltSpace go under. Earlier this year, we've just seen Future Lighthouse, the content production agency, go under as well. And I wanted to get your perspective on this. Do you think that the industry is slowing down? Do you think it's speeding up? Or what are the challenges there that you're seeing to companies in the space? I'll start with you, Harri.
Well, obviously, I mean, the consumer appetite for VR and AR is probably being slower than most investors would have liked to. I see. I think we're still so early on that I wouldn't make really rash, decisions about it. And I think, I come from the Nordic world where usually startups are pretty frugal with their burn rates and how they spend money and how they raise money. So I think there's been some overinvestment probably, and there's been some overspending. But I think the stuff we're seeing now, let's say globally, like something like big screen VR seeing traction, and VR chat hitting massive numbers on Steam. Obviously, that has a non-VR component as well. But I think the general sort of consumer appetite for VR is getting stronger and stronger. But I think we're still so early that I wouldn't make too many judgment yet on whether it's failed or not.
Yeah, I agree. Altspace was rescued by Microsoft now.
That's true.
So
actually, yeah.
it was. So I think there's still kind of things happening like that, where a community will go like, "But we love this. Like, let's make it work," and its user base is heard by a large organisation. I know it's a bit of a random one, but yeah, I agree with Harri to the extent that it's early days. These kind of spikes and peaks and troughs are going to happen, and also. That ultimately the trend is still upwards, right? There's still money going in, like 2017 on 2016, the investment has still gone up. And I think if you take out some of the kind of bigger, like Improbables, Magic Leaps, those kinds of names, then actually, in terms of the Immerse UK group anyway, the chat is that it's much like any investment in any other technology, that it sort of mimics that. It's very similar, the investment patterns, apart from those absolutely huge ones. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting in the case of Altspace, they jumped in quite early on in terms of what they wanted to do and the vision they had, which meant that for them in particular, they didn't really know where the market would be heading, and no one could really predict back then when the investments...
Do we still know?
No. And I think that's a big point, is no matter how many experts there are that predict numbers, we still don't know the exact figures of where this industry is heading. And for Altspace, no one can predict exactly what they needed to do to adapt and change to be able to make it. And I think that's, now with Microsoft coming on board with that, I think they're going to have a big, long, hard think about what they want to do and really think about what the industry is going to need them to do in particular.
Yeah, I think investment in virtual reality and augmented reality actually does still require a leap of faith. A lot of our early work is obviously funded by businesses come to us and ask us to do specific projects. But over the last few years, we've actually been looking to raise raise money for specific companies and specific projects. And I think it's getting easier in terms of more people know what virtual reality is all about, and more people know what augmented reality is all about. So that does help. We've actually been around the world looking to raise money for certain projects. And it's interesting, I think probably at the moment, if you're in America, it's a lot easier to raise money in virtual reality and augmented reality, without a shadow of doubt. And in other places now, like China, they're very, very positive about virtual reality especially. So there's money there to be invested. But also new markets like India, I think, is somewhere that the investment money is going to come out of. But in terms of the UK, I think it's, there are definitely people willing to invest. It's just a matter of finding them. Of course, there are other ways of getting investment. You could try and crowdfund it. I mean, really sort of virtual reality as it exists now will exist because of a crowdfunding Kickstarter campaign for Oculus Rift. This is really why we're here, one of the reasons why we're here right now. And of course, when Palmer Luckey went out, he was originally asked after about $250,000, and he got 10 times that amount. And that started to raise interest, because that showed that there was an underlying current of people who were interested in seeing virtual reality happen and become big, and were frustrated from what had happened to it since the late 80s and early 90s. So really, almost single-handedly, he's certainly sort of got VR back where everybody could see and start to talk about it. So you could do crowdfunding. There's lots of different ways to raise money. Perhaps we could talk about those type of things.
Yeah, so in regards to different ways to raise money, as I know that the current definition for a lot of people, they say investment, they think that means trading company equity for capital. But there are lots of different ways to raise money, aren't there? What kind of opportunities have you folks seen for gaining capital without necessarily having to give away your company for it?
Well, so like I said, I'm from Helsinki, Finland. So in Finland, actually the government has a very aggressive policy towards technology investments, where you can sort of double down on any private money you get from investors from the government as grants or very cheap loans. And that has partly been the reason why Finland has been such a powerhouse in gaming, for example, because we've been missing the sort of very early angel funds, let's say, that maybe the UK has and especially the US has, and the government has sort of stepped in to help with that early stage. So, for example, all of the companies that are from Finland in our portfolio where we invested, we were able to sort of double down that investment with government money. So I think you guys have something similar here in the UK.
Do you feel that it's easier for the companies in Helsinki to identify those grants and those loans and the things that are available to them?
It's been very actively marketed by the government, yes, and also all of the sort of VR, AR communities that exist, for example, in the Nordics, know and share that knowledge quite openly. Where can funding be acquired from? So I think that's a very sort of, it's not like a secret where you can get it. I mean, there's obviously a you have to apply for it, and there's a certain process to it, but it's not like they keep it, hidden and secret.
And that's very similar to what's going on with Immerse UK and that network being set up in the last year or so, and the knowledge transfer networks here, which are sort of doing stuff to try and connect these groups of people together and make this stuff widely available. Immerse UK just put out a list, of all of the, it's just a Google Doc, which is on immerseuk.org, I think is the URL, which has got a list of all of the funding available to UK organisations. Some obviously it's regional specific, but a lot of it is UK wide, and it covers everything from the Innovate UK grants on emerging enabled technologies. The next round I think is coming out in March, which is kind of grants from either under 100,000 or over 100,000. They're great. Like we got one to develop a piece, a sort of middleware, if you like, to help us make our content. So they're not necessarily funding the content pieces, but they are funding the kind of more the infrastructure sides or the scalable pieces.
Yeah, it's exactly the
same. They're helping us grow.
In Finland, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting from an organisational point of view. They're grants, which is amazing, that you have to cash flow the grant, which is depending on the point of start where you're at. If you haven't got any working capital, that might be harder. So you've kind of got to be at a healthy, stable position. So they're not taking massive risks, but they are at least funding any size of organisation that can take that money.
As long as you can prove that you're stable.
Well, I say that just because they want you to cash flow, I don't know, between 100 and 300,000 pounds worth of grant money, so like over on a quarterly basis. So you need to have a little bit of liquidity in there, obviously, to make sure that's possible. Then there's all of the R&D tax credits and the creative industries tax credits. So there's like other ways that the government are trying to help create a bit of space or support for those organisations. I don't know like how viable that is for everybody, but there's those things that exist. And then you've got Yuki obviously doing their thing. I don't know that much about that. And also Creative England, who have always funded film, but are also thinking about funding, or they do fund games. And now they're kind of looking at, well, what's the crossover between game and film? And it's landing in, having conversations with people like us to say, well, what are you doing? And how might we fund you on a loan basis?
Are you seeing a lot of uptake from immersive technology startups for this? So you've got lots of demand for people coming to you asking for information about this access to funding?
Yes. I don't have a great picture of what it's like at the kind of higher or the scalable end, but I think there's a massive amount of demand for the Innovate UK pots of money anyway. And then there was the Creative XR fund recently. It's 20 grand. It's not there wasn't a very big pot of money.
No, but it's enough to start something,
call.
Isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. There's a big call for projects on that. But again, it's a project. We're not necessarily looking, we had talked about it briefly before. They're not necessarily scalable ventures. It's a project, and I think there's It's just getting clear between, what's your organisation doing, what kind of money does it want to blend a little bit of the project money to ultimately create a scalable organisation. Like, I think depending on who you are and at what point in your growth you're at, there's lots of different options.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the R&D tax credits are one of the best things that the government are doing at the moment, and I think that helps. I think also the BFI are also helping. There are credits you can get there by going into gaming as well, so that's definitely another place to go to. But I think that generally we're woefully behind places like Portugal and Lisbon, and especially Vancouver in Canada, and also Singapore. The government should be investing much more in the VR and AR infrastructure in this country.
I think what's interesting about that, rather than it's about those countries, right? Canada and France, particularly from my point of view, both got quite big media funds, and they fund content for content's sake. So they're looking like to find the next big director, and knowing that the distribution of this kind of content will work itself out as they're funding these kind of bigger content ideas, and that's brilliant. And I got a grant from the BFI because they're starting to look into how they fund sort of content in this field, but because the distribution isn't really understood yet, because there's just not that many headsets in houses or in public places yet, that I think the content funders or the BFI and people like that are a little bit on the back foot in the UK in terms of how they're starting to put money into directors or production companies.
So you've had experience with funds across Europe, and you've been all across the world, and your company operates globally. What kind of different attitudes are there towards investing? Like, we know there's different cultures and different cultural attitudes depending on where you are globally. But what's the investment environment like? Are there places that are more keen to put in money? Are there places that aren't so keen, but it's easier to find access to the money?
Yes, there's definitely. I'll start off with the States. In a lot of hotspots in the States, especially Boston and obviously Silicon Valley. In the States, they're much more likely to invest in an idea and invest in you particularly. In the UK, it's still very much show us what the return is, and it's got to be guaranteed before you get any money. So I think we're much more conservative in this country. Other countries like South Korea and China, for instance, are very keen to invest. They like virtual reality, especially in China. They see this as something which is going to be huge in their particular market. And they want to be at the front. They felt that they were sort of lagging behind in mobile technology. They want to get into the front of VR technology. But of course, there are really two types of investments. Are you asking for investment for hardware, or are you asking investment for software? And I think that also makes a difference about where you can raise the capital.
I think one of the interesting things about the investment that comes from China, and especially for that Asian kind of ecosystem that's around it, is it's very much a different world that you are going into when you look at the products and the hardware and the pace at which it is coming out. And when we're looking, especially when the companies that we've spoken to, is just to reiterate really what Dan said, is that a lot of the US companies are getting that funding because the investors are really interested in the people, not necessarily the business plan, which I don't know if you see that in Helsinki as well, but I think in the UK they're a lot more conservative with looking at the business plans, looking at the numbers, less about the people.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that any investment in virtual reality is still a leap of faith, because we have to build up the market, and that market requires hardware and software to reach a certain point where it's going to be attractive for consumers to use, and we're not there yet. And I think so. From an investor point of view, it requires somebody thinking, you know what, I'm actually going to believe in what's going to happen in the future. And as I say, I think in certain countries they're more likely to do that. In the UK, it's much more hard-nosed at the moment. But I think that, as I say, in Boston we were very well received. The same in Silicon Valley, and I think that funny enough, I think that just in the last few months, we've got a lot more interest back in the UK, but that's probably because other countries and other companies inside those countries are showing interest as well. So it's a bit like people don't want to miss a bandwagon. If they see somebody else investing, then you're likely to get more investment opportunities as well.
Yeah, I think that what you said about the UK also applies to Europe in general, I feel like, because there's a lot of that conservatism and people are not sort of willing to take that leap of faith. But if you look at, let's say, our lead investor, Gumi, a Japanese company, their CEO, Kunimitsu, he believed 3 years ago that this was going to be a fundamental shift in computing platforms, and that's why he allocated most of Gumi's investment operations into VR, AR, and I think that's how Asian investors are built. That if they really believe in something, they're willing to sort of, and of course through that comes over investment as well. We probably heard about these hundreds and hundreds of VR headset developers in China already going bankrupt, but that's how they do it. I mean, they go overboard, but out of that comes something new. And do
you think within those 3 years he's proving his point? Do you think he's kind of going, this is good, this is the right? Is he still allocating that level of investment?
Yes, I think so, and I think they, what they try to do is what Steve was saying. They're trying to find the best teams, but also operate in those areas. So that's why they did their fund investments, for example, to Silicon Valley, because they feel that those funds are sort of best equipped for getting the world-class teams in, and I think that's something where European entrepreneurs should we need to step up as well, because we don't want to be losing out to Silicon Valley on that side all the time.
Absolutely, I think Silicon Valley is a little bit of a club, and it becomes an investors' club, because if somebody is successful, they definitely actually distribute a lot of their money down the food chain into other companies and people within their local infrastructure.
Yeah, and one of the things that's sort of related there is if you do content, I mean, obviously the well-funded hardware companies are also a source of investment. I don't think they've been doing it as much as they did in the very beginning of the hardware cycle, but I feel like now that Oculus is coming out with the Oculus Go, which is the standalone, and also Vive, the new Vive Focus, I think the hardware companies are again willing to make investments into content, because they need that content to drive sales.
I mean, that's definitely certain for us that they're a big source of funding in terms of projects or adaptations of projects that we want to put on their platforms and things like that. And then there's the kind of wrangling over, obviously it's our IP, but the wrangling comes over what price point do you put it out at. If they funded it, do you have to, like with the first piece we put out was for free, which is great, but then if we could have just got a small price on it, then that could have funded our next piece out there. So there's this sort of negotiation that happens around that.
And I guess if you're getting a return or you're getting revenue from that, it means you wouldn't have to rely on grants and investment in the future.
Yeah, potentially do a sales-based growth instead of a kind of commission or project growth. Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions, now's the time to start thinking about them. So we talked about this earlier before we started, when we were still getting mic'd up. What are your thoughts on the distribution of investment money? Do you think that there are certain opportunities that are being missed? Do you think there are certain things that are overfunded? I'd love to open up to all of you.
Yeah, I think that actually it's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. I think that certain companies like Magic Leap have actually vacuumed up a huge amount of investment cash on really sort of one project, and basically we all hope they get it right, because if they don't get it right, that's a $3 billion out of the investment opportunities for other companies, and I think actually a lot of that money should have been distributed around 100 other companies, not just betting it all on black.
At least we've seen something now, though, eh?
Yes,
That's exciting.
what have you seen? You've seen a couple of photographs that were really sort of staged,
True.
and I doubt that actually is going to be the product that they actually launch, because they've changed so much. Because if anybody thinks that Magic Leap is going to provide what they said they were going to provide originally, and what they got, for instance, people from Google to invest in right at the beginning, they're not. They've completely changed. It's going to be a pale imitation of what they said they were going to do. And that's obviously a problem for investors. How do you keep people? How do you invest in something which people are going to say, trust me, I'm going to produce this, whether that's a physical product or it's an idea for something. You know, it requires a big leap of faith for people to actually sort of invest and hope that people are actually going to stay on the course that they're going to. But on the other hand, you have to be agile, because sometimes, as with Magic Leap, it was just going to prove impossible to actually sort of give the actual sort of visual ideas that they had in order to actually sort of give the fantastic quality of actually putting something within inside a room. It's technically possible, and it's technically possible inside a lab, but it's not technically possible to put it on a headset that you can wear. So you've got to give companies a little bit of leeway to manoeuvre, but also I think companies have also got to sort of be really honest about what they're asking the money for, and in actual fact not produce fantastic concept videos which are never ever going to be
we spent $3 billion on videos.
Well,
did you want to add something?
No, that's a good point, because one of the companies in our first portfolio is a company called Immersal. They're doing an AR platform for retail, and they have stuff now running live on iPhones and iPads using ARKit. I was in a conference where Nokia was sort of showcasing their vision around AR, and they had the same thing, but that was a CGI generated concept video. Yeah. And these guys are already doing it as a startup, as an eight-person startup. So, yeah, I hear what you're saying. But I would say, like, there's probably nice opportunities in hardware. For example, one of the biggest investments that in the space was done in the Nordics was Varjo, which is a high-resolution headset that's being created in Helsinki, Finland. And that team came out of Nokia and Microsoft, and they worked on HoloLens, for example, and it was a small team, and now they've scaled up quite nicely. So I think, you know, who knows about the distribution, who knows how that will be, but at least the sort of the betas that I've tried are pretty mind-blowing. And I think there's going to be like innovation done also in the fringes outside of, you know, maybe Oculus, HTC, Magic Leap, and also like controllers, for example. It's a very interesting space. Full haptic suits. You know, there's so much we are still missing from the sort of control side in terms of like being there, present in virtual reality. That I feel like that there's probably something pretty amazing going to be there in a couple of years.
Before you open it up, there's one other thing I just wanted to mention, and that was about, in actual fact, sort of crowdfunding. Because a lot of people think that it's a good idea to crowdfund, and it can be, but it's a lot more difficult than people imagine. To be quite honest, if you're going to do, for instance, a Kickstarter campaign, you better have between £35,000 and £50,000 to do it properly before you do the campaign, because otherwise you will probably not get any traction whatsoever.
Cool. Any quick additions from YouTube before I open it up?
Just one thing that I forgot to mention earlier about this challenge fund that Innovate UK and some others are kind of going to put out there. The government announced it in their white paper from the last budget, which is a £33 million fund for immersive, for audiences of the future, I think they call it. So one to look out for in the next few months. I think they'll be announcing that, which is around a bit of content and a bit of technologies which will help build audiences for this stuff, which I think is quite interesting for the government.
Cool. Anything? Are you good?
That's good.
Cool. All right. Any questions? Colin, we've got 10 minutes. Hit me with questions. Cool. All right. Okay, we're going to the back first, and then we'll go to you, Patrick. Sammy.
Hi. Thank you for an excellent panel. Just building on what you were saying, Steve, with regards to the funding in Magic Leap, there was an article that came out, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, by Upload that was talking around last year having $3 billion invested into the VR and AR industry and how this was a new record that we'd hit. But when you kind of started to read through the lines, $500 million, as you said, went to Magic Leap. $500 million went to Improbable, which is fantastic for them. $200 million went to Unity, which I'm not sure why that was considered a VR investment. And then 200 more went to Niantic Studios for Pokemon Go or the new Harry Potter. So what are your opinions on kind of like the little man or the little woman, you know, the startup? who are trying to actually survive, and are they seeing this money trickle down to them, and what are the kind of strategies you would suggest for them to get exposure to this, record 3 billion that we saw last year?
That's a very good question. I think trickle is the word, because the money is there. I think you have to be you definitely have to spread your net wide and just talk to a lot of people. And it's all about raising the profile of what you want to do, whether it's a project or whether it's something that you want to make. And the more PR, the more you talk about it, the more you come to shows like this and actually engage with people and talk to people, then the higher chances are of actually raising money. But it's a long slog. I mean, be prepared for the the hard graft. It isn't necessarily going to happen within the first month or within the first 6 months. It could take three years to actually get the right type of investment.
I mean, raising money is almost just a full-time job on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since we, for Medical Realities, we raised angel funding in September of 2016, and then almost immediately after that, we started informal discussions about looking for a funding round right afterwards, because it takes all that time to actually put it into place.
Eleanor, as someone who's on a access to finance working group, what kind of methods are Innovate UK and Immerse UK using to try and push the information out there? Is it anything else apart from the document you mentioned earlier?
Information about what funding exists.
Yes.
I think they've got their boot camps that they're doing, which is a series of workshops and things like that on boot camps to get companies into them. They did a series of getting investment ready, open to immersive companies. They've got access to Investor Day coming up in March, where people can pitch, sort of live pitching stuff, the usual, which I think you can find that through Immerse and that network, and you can probably find it in a lot of other places. There's angel networks and people like that doing and kind of creating their own pipelines, I think. There's the kind of access to resources, and I don't know, for us, the internet, of course, is just a wonderful place as ever, and there's a lot of knowledge there. The report that I think you just referenced, I read the executive summary of, this about the trends. I think there's a lot of knowledge out there, and there's a lot of ways, if you're building up your own plan.
So in that case, if you take that hat off and put your other hat on,
yeah.
How easy do you find it to find finance as Marshmallow Laser Feast?
I think it depends what finance you're talking about. We haven't raised investment for ourselves yet. That's something we're just at the very, very beginning of, just to work out, well, what does investment look like for a content company who's interested in exploiting its own IPs and new ones, branded or non-branded. What kind of growth, we talked about what's scalable and what's not, and I think that's something we're at the very beginning of. So there's a lot of our funding to date has come from commissions and other, basically people funding us to make content, either because they like what we do or to branded content for other people.
Great. You got anything to add?
On the question of how do we get money trickled down from Improbable, I would say if you're a content creator and you're looking to build immersive worlds, you should probably go talk to Improbable right about now and ask them that what sort of support can they give you if you look into use their engine, for example. And I do the same with Magic Leap, because there's got to be a part of that investment is got to be earmarked for creating content.
And already, right? Like we're getting those conversations are happening now. So Magic Leap announced their product, and 2 days later, someone we'd met in at the end of last year is like, yeah, sure, come and see us. We'll get you out here. Microsoft are doing the same. They're kind of inviting people that they know who put content out there to come and start being there. But I guess they've got to be ready, whatever that means. It's different for each company, right? But ready for you.
Yeah, I also think there are certain, where you're looking for money, I think that it's interesting that there are certain companies that are interested in funding virtual reality and augmented reality, a lot more in America and China, as we talked about. if you get money from those companies in those countries, they'll probably expect you to open up an office there, because a lot of them won't actually invest in a company which is actually doesn't exist close to where they operate mainly from. There are a few good investment companies in the UK, you know, that sort of that have invested in companies like Dreams, for instance. You know, but I think they're very few and far between at the moment.
Cool. Right, and I know you've got a question. Got about 3 minutes left, so please don't make it too difficult for our panelists.
Okay, really quick then. So our experience has been that seed funding with the SEIS and EIS schemes actually isn't too bad in the UK. They're brilliant, but certainly Series A was hard, and Series B, everyone's saying you should just go to San Francisco. Is there anything that we can do as an industry with Tiger and Yuki to try and get the government to improve? You know, what can we do to improve access to Series A and Series B here in the UK? Is there any advice you'd give us to lobby the government?
Quick answers.
Well, I think, yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that it should be easier to do than it is. And I think that, like all these sort of things, they seem to be sort of, they make it more complex than it should be. So I think make it easier, but also just actually sort of get the word out there that these things are viable. But also remember that even to actually be eligible for SEIS and EIS schemes, actually you've got to have probably £10,000 in order to set the company up correctly for that in the first place. So you know, you need money to get money as well.
Do you think? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say. Do you think your main challenge is the infrastructure, or the kind of the fact that the government or the sector make it difficult for investors to invest, or is it the outlook of the investors, and is it a bit of both? Yeah, that's why people would say go to America, because it's easier to raise it there.
Yeah.
So we need to change our culture of investing, maybe.
This is so interesting to hear, because in Finland, in the Nordics, if you can do a seed round quite easily, but if you want to do a Series A, then we usually go to the UK. Or we go to Europe, and you guys need to go from seed to the US. So.
Although it's interesting, I mean, the Slush Fund conference, for instance, is getting huge now.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And I mean, it's you know, so that's a sort of, and that's all about raising money.
Yeah.
It's
But that's a great thing for Helsinki. But obviously, like that attracts startups from all over the world and investors all over the world.